Thank you for joining us here at Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. And each week we invite you to send in your questions and we'll explore the fascinating stories and history of the city of Mississauga together. Like, subscribe, and follow us and stay up to date on all the heritage happenings with Heritage Mississauga. This week's episode is inspired by a day I spent in the office. I was working on the weekend by myself and usually for a quiet day preparing some exhibit material. And we aren't normally open at our offices at the Grange on the weekend. And we had a couple of people stop by just curious about the building and had a tour and chatted a little bit about local history. And some of the questions that were brought up I thought would make a fascinating story here to share at Ask a Historian. So here we go. The first one that we touched on was the story of Bencree Drive down in Port Credit, and that is the name inspiration for Bencree. And the name comes from the estate of A.M. Hoberlin, that is Andrew Hoberlin. The name is Bencree is Scottish in origin, and it's believed to translate to "within my heart." Andrew Hoberlin was a wealthy resident of Port Credit and the owner of the House of Hoberlin Tailors Limited, which was a major men's closure in Toronto. Andrew Hoberlin and his wife Alicia were among the founders of the Peel Memorial Hospital in Brampton and were widely known for their work among wounded veterans in the First World War. Their Port Credit home, which they originally dubbed Bencree, was also open as a home for local wounded veterans and to receive medical care and convalescence on their return from the war. They were members of the Loyola Guild and the Port Credit Catholic League, which were both focused on supporting soldiers and the war effort overseas through donations and fundraising efforts here at home. They were also life members of the Canadian Red Cross, the Port Credit IODE, that is Imperial Order of the Daughters of the Empire. It was a women's charitable and educational organization, and they were founding members of the Navy League of Canada, so quite involved in the philanthropic efforts here at home, supporting our troops in the war effort overseas during the First World War. Among the Hoberlins' most significant connections to the First World War was the establishment of a trust called the Justice for Seamen and Airmen Decency and Chivalry Trust. That's quite a mouthful to say. And it was set up to provide income for wounded seamen and airmen returning from the war who were unable to work. In September of 1918, the trust raised $380,000, equivalent to almost $7 million today, one of the largest private funds raised in Canada at that time, all solicited through private donations. On August 4th of 1919, the Hoberlins hosted a return man's parade and victory party at Bencree for returning soldiers from the First World War. So as Port Credit evolved and properties get subdivided and developed, roads are put in, subdivision roads, to support kind of this early growth of community. And this is what happened to the Hoberlin's property of Bencree, that it was subdivided and ultimately other homes were built. The old Hoberlin house still remains a private family house today, but the street that was subdivided through the Hoberlin property came to bear the name that the Hoberlins had given their own estate, that is Bencree, meaning within my heart. Our second one is a fun one that comes up from time to time, and I always answer it a little bit with kind of a smirk and a tongue-in-cheek answer. But the question is, 10th line west, what is it west of? And well, my smirky answer for a little bit is usually it's not west of anything. But to give you a little bit of background between the question we had on the weekend was 9th line and 10th line, what do they mean? And it's kind of a neat way to look at the landscape and its historic evolution over time. I can talk for hours about surveys, but I realize that most people will probably glaze over as we begin to explore those. But just there are interesting ways in our landscape that the past land division decisions and surveys are remembered in different fashions, if you will. So Mississauga, to give you a little bit of background to 9th and 10th line as part of Mississauga, Mississauga's borders have changed over time through expansion and expropriation and the like. And back in the early 2000s, our western border expanded up in the northwest part of Mississauga to encompass parts of 10th line and 9th line. Um, these areas between Winston Churchill and Ninth Line were once part of Trafalgar Township and Halton County. That is, they were not part of historic Mississauga, then Toronto Township, or Peel County. They belonged to a different county, if you will. The historical difference plays out on our landscape today in the form of those road names, Ninth Line and 10th Line. Lines, which were roads, basically ran north-south and were surveyed between 1806 and 1819, depending where you are in the survey, and they were surveyed through Peel and Halton County. Each county had a baseline or a starting point on the landscape in terms of the survey. It was very quite simple, actually. A 0.0, and that everything was kind of east, west, north, south of that point. And so in historic Mississauga, that baseline for the early survey was here Ontario Street in terms of its 0 point on the landscape of the survey. And so the intersection was the 0 point. Again, the start point on the landscape is Dundas and here Ontario, just in terms of orienting yourself. Lines were north-south roads that ran parallel to the center road, parallel to here Ontario Street, east and west of here Ontario Street. And they were numbered sequentially. So first line east was the first north-south road east of here Ontario Street that ran parallel to here Ontario Street. And similarly, first line west was simply the same on the west side of here Ontario Street, and so on. So they radiated numerically out from that center point. But over time, the lines were named. They received names, and for instance, we once had a second line east, which ran parallel to Center Road. We know that today as Tompkin Road, and first line being Cawthra, and so they received names over time. On the west side of our landscape, our survey ended at the Town Line, or 7th Line West, 6th Line West, and that was Winston Churchill Boulevard, and was so named today. And so again, you have these names, First Line East and Third Line East now carry the names of Cawthra Road and Dixie Road respectively. And so that numerical numbering system, which was quite easy to kind of orient yourself on a landscape of where you were, it was replaced largely in time. We still have little stretches of Second Line West and Fifth Line West that still carry their numeric designations that appear in our landscape, but for the most part, within Mississauga, those numerical references have disappeared and carry names today. And so where it shows up on our landscape really then is that extension into Halton County, formerly Trafalgar Township, where parts of 10th Line and then bordering on 9th Line became part of Mississauga. However, Halton County's numbering system was different than Peel's or Toronto Townships here. There was no center point, and therefore there was no east or west designations that were required on the landscape. The starting point for the survey in Halton is known today as Tremaine Road. And the lines, that is, again, the north-south roads that ran parallel to Tremaine Road at regular intervals, were only surveyed eastward, ending when they literally bumped into or ran into the Peel County border. So in this way, 10 lines were surveyed, 9th Line and 10th Line, portions of which, again, now lie within Mississauga, belong to this survey of Halton County. And they again run adjacent to Winston Churchill, and they're parallel to Winston Churchill, but they in that sense, Winston Churchill historically was 6th Line. Sorry, this might get a little confusing with numbers. Winston Churchill was historically 6th Line, and it bumps up adjacent to 10th Line. But of course, 10th Line belonged to our survey. And so when Mississauga expanded, they added a name designation of west on 10th Line West. And it's technically incorrect. 10th Line was only ever east of Tremaine Road, and it didn't have a designation of east or west. So technically, 10th Line isn't west of anything. So anyway, those are those nuances that play out on the landscape, and they're kind of fun stories to tell of the numbering system that eventually, in many ways, begot names, but in some cases, the number still resonates on the landscapes well over 150 years after they were first surveyed. So our next question revolved around the spelling of a road in Streetsville, and that is Ker Street. Ker spelled Kerr. The person who came into the Grange referenced that they did visited a historic cemetery up in Streetsville, and they saw the family gravestone with the name Ker, Ker, and they wondered if there was a connection between Ker with two R's on the street sign and Ker with one R as the family who once lived in Streetsville, and the answer is yes. Ker Street, with two R's in Streetsville, takes its name from the Ker family with one R, although the street name at some point acquired the second R, and we're not entirely sure because the family didn't spell it that way. But Thomas Ker was a native of Cumberland County in England. He arrived in Streetsville around 1835, so a very early settling family in Streetsville. His sister Helen was married to the prominent Streetsville resident and businessman John Beatty, who was a mill owner in Streetsville. Thomas Ker himself was a carpenter and painter by trade, and he established a successful chair and turning factory on the Credit River in Streetsville, harnessing the natural water power that's available in the Credit River. Thomas's wife, they had several children, including William, John, and Henry. The three brothers followed in their father's footsteps, as was quite often the case, and established the William Ker and Brothers Chair Factory in Streetsville in 1851. In 1857, the company began to manufacture bobbins and spools, and production peaked during the American Civil War, as bobbins and spools were in high demand for the American textile industry. John and Henry Ker retired in 1883, and the company was left to Henry's son, Thomas. Thomas entered into a partnership with another Streetsville resident by the name of James Brocklebank, and the following year, in 1884, the company relocated to Walkerton, Ontario. In 1898, the company relocated again, and this time to Parry Sound, and was renamed the Canada Spool and Bobbin Factory. In 1903, the company changed hands again and was moved back to Walkerton, Ontario, where it continued to operate until its closure in 1988. So we're not dealing with ancient history here. The Canada Spool and Bobbin Company, which again ceased operation in 1988, began under the direction of William Ker and Brothers in 1851 in Streetsville. And so the Ker family, K-E-R, lent their name to Ker Street, K-E-R-R, and the street once led down the Credit River Valley to the location of the company, the family factory. So there's a short tidbit, if you will. So the next time you're in the Streetsville Memorial Cemetery on Queen Street, and you spy the Ker family name with the single R, they do lend themselves on the landscape, even if over time we've misspelled the name. And our last one comes from a little something Irish on our landscape, and that it connects to the story of Derry Road, or perhaps more appropriately, as it was one time named, at least on a map, as Holderness Street. East-west concession roads in the new survey of Toronto Township were not originally named, but rather they were numbered. But it quickly became custom to refer to roads by the names of prominent places they intersected with. For example, Britannia Road took its name because it led to the hamlet of Britannia, and many locals referred to it unofficially as the Britannia Side Road. One exception, albeit one that didn't catch on, was that of Derry Road. Perhaps we should call it Holderness Street. There is an 1877 town plan and an even older one from 1856, when the government road allowance that would later become Derry Road was actually laid out and named Holderness Street by surveyor John Stoughton Dennis. The name apparently never caught on, as the locals began to refer to it as the Derry West Side Road, because it led to the burgeoning village of Derry West, which was located around here on Ontario Street and what is now Derry Road. The name of the village and the road was later officially shortened from the Derry West Side Road to the Derry Side Road to Derry Road, and in the 1950s, the name was officially applied to the entire length of the road, hence the name Derry Road. And our Irish connection comes from the inspiration or the naming of Derry West, the small community, which was named in reference to Londonderry in Ireland. So Holderness Street / Derry Road, a name that has some interesting twists in its story before it comes to be known as Derry Road as it is today. Anyway, so thank you for spending some time with us here at Ask a Historian. Please send in your questions. We look forward to seeing you out there in the community. Each and every week here at Ask a Historian, we'll have some fun exploring the fascinating chapters of the history of the city of Mississauga together. Like, subscribe, and follow us and stay up to date on all the heritage happenings with Heritage Mississauga. And we'll see you next week here at Ask a Historian.